This lecture will focus on the Lycophytes and the transition from bryophytes to vascular plants. We are going to start today by talking about phylogenies. Phylogenies are visual depictions of the relationships among species. So these are going to look like family trees, but they are going to instead show how different groups of species relate to one another. We next are going to talk about some transitional plant species between the bryophytes and the lycophytes, and these are plants that we know from fossil evidence. Next, we are going to talk about lycophytes. Lycophytes are plants, the first vascular plants that evolved that are still with us today. We will look at some features that are present in the lycophytes that were not present in the bryophytes. These will include a dominant sporophyte generation, true roots, and simple leaves that have veins in them. We are going to talk very briefly about two groups of lycophytes you may encounter, and we will talk quickly about lycophytes' historical importance and how we use them today. So this is a diagram I showed in a previous lecture, and it just shows the major groups of plants that we are talking about this semester. Remember that charophytes are not true plants, they are green algae, but they are the algae lineage that gave rise to all of the true terrestrial plants. We said the bryophytes aren't really one group, but they are three groups that have some similar traits. Those were the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. When I showed you this diagram last time, I accidentally had this group labeled as liverworts. This should have been labeled as lycophytes or lycopods. Those are the same things. And so this will be the group that we focus on today. You can see from my depiction that many of them are small, but at least historically there used to be tree-sized ones. Then the groups that we still will have left to talk about are the ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So we're going to think now about how these different groups are related to one another. To do that, we need to use diagrams, or at least it's a lot easier. And so I want to start by talking about how to interpret these diagrams. These diagrams will be phylogenies, and a phylogeny is a depiction of relationships among species or groups of species. To interpret these, you need to know that the groups that are more closely connected, closer to branch tips, are also more closely related. It's a hard idea, but it's a lot easier if we think about it among individuals, let's say among you and your family members, instead of trying to think about species. Once we get this idea, then we can go back and apply it to species. So on this depiction, let's imagine that everybody up here at the top is part of your generation. And here you are over on the far right. And just for the example, we're going to focus here on females because it gets more complicated if we try to think about individuals with two parents. So this will be just a depiction of your maternal relationships, those involving the females in your family. So here you are, and let's at least imagine that you have a sister who is depicted here. You two are in the same generation, and if this is your sister, that means you presumably both have the same mother. Your mother is depicted here. Now, of course, your mother had a mother, and this is your grandmother. And let's imagine that your grandmother also had another daughter. This individual then is your aunt, and if your aunt had two kids, then these would be your cousins. So on this diagram, if you wanted to know who you were most closely related to out of this generation, of course it's going to be your sister. But the way you see that visually is by following your branch down and seeing which branch it most closely connects to. It connects right here most immediately, and if we follow that down, of course it comes to your sister. To get to your cousins, we would have to follow this branch back to an earlier ancestor, namely your grandmother. So it's 1 step to your sister, 2 steps to your grandmother. That means you're more closely related to your sister than your cousins. Now, of course, you've got an extended family too, and this might involve second cousins. Your second cousins on your maternal side are going to be related to you through your great-grandmother. So that's, of course, your mother's mother, and then her other female descendants. So you can see on this diagram that you're more closely related to your cousins than your second cousins by the fact that you only have to go back 2 steps to get to a common ancestor with your cousins, but you need to go back 3 steps to get to a common ancestor with your second cousins. So our general rule is that you will always be more closely related to relatives with whom you more recently shared a common ancestor. And we just said this, you are more closely related to your sister than your cousins, and to your cousins than your second cousins. This next point may be a little bit less intuitive. Your second cousins are equally related to you, your sister, and your cousins. That seems weird. If you just looked at the diagram, here's a second cousin. It might look like this second cousin is more closely related to your cousins than to you, or even to your sister than to you, but that's not true. And to see why, we just need to go back to our general rule to figure out how closely related you are, see how far back on the tree you need to go to connect. So let's look at all of your second cousins. Regardless of which one we choose, let's imagine just this one for example, then the only way that we're going to get back to you, your sister, or your cousins on this tree is by following this second cousin back to her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. That puts us right here on the tree. But this is the same ancestor for you, your sister, and your cousins. You all come back to this point on the tree. If you're all coming back to the same point on the tree, 3 steps back, then this second cousin is equally related to you, your sister, and your cousins. It's the same number of steps to all 3 of you. So we're going to use those same rules when we interpret phylogenies that depict species instead of this tree of descent depicting individuals. So here we're switching to a phylogeny of plants, and these are the groups of plants that we've already talked about. Here at the very far left we have the charophytes. Remember, charophytes are not true plants. They're a member of the green algae group. But I'm putting them on here because it was the charophytes that did give rise to all of these other groups of terrestrial plants. Then, if we follow this back to the very base, this point right here is the ancestor of both the charophytes and all of the terrestrial plants. We go one way, we get to the charophytes. We go the other way, we get to the terrestrial plants. Within the terrestrial plants, we get a split first to the liverworts, to here, then to the mosses, then to the hornworts, then the group we are focusing on today, the Lycophytes, and then the 3 groups we have yet to discuss, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So this diagram tells us some counterintuitive things. For example, let's focus on the hornworts. We said in the lecture about bryophytes that the hornworts were the kind of bryophyte that was most closely related to the vascular plants. And I said that, but I didn't really show you why. So here you can see why that is. If we follow the hornwort lineage back to a common ancestor, that common ancestor is right here. And you can see that then this common ancestor also goes to this group that includes the lycophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. If we wanted to see how, let's say, the mosses connect, we would have to go one step further back in time to get from all of these vascular plants up here back to the mosses. And if we wanted to get back to the liverworts, we would have to go 2 steps back to here. So if our rule is that things that connect closer to the tips are more closely related, then this group here of all of the vascular plants, everything from the lycophytes over, is more closely related to the hornworts, next more closely related to the mosses, and least closely related to the liverworts. We also can see now why the word bryophytes is in quotes. It's not a true group because these 3 lineages are not each other's closest relatives. To see that, let's just follow the mosses back. And you can see that the mosses come back to here. So the mosses are more closely related to everything in this direction, the hornworts and all of these vascular plants, than the mosses are to the liverworts, because to get to the liverworts we have to go back in time. To get to all of these other lineages, we can do it getting closer to the tips. So, before we move on, remember that today we are mostly focusing on this transition from the hornworts to the lycophytes, as well as talking about characteristics of the lycophytes. There were several lineages besides the lycophytes that evolved from a hornwort-like ancestor. And the details of these different groups vary. We are going to generalize and just talk about them as a group. So in these early land plants groups, first, remember that they evolved from a common ancestor of the hornworts. We see some new features. They have a well-developed cuticle. This means, remember, that they have a waxy coating that prevents them from water loss. This is going to help them survive in a dry terrestrial environment. The bryophytes had to live in moist areas, partly because they lack this. Second, in these early land plants, there are stomata present. Remember that in this case, the stomata are going to function to balance water loss and gas exchange for photosynthesis. So when the plant has lots of water, they can open and allow gas exchange to occur. But when it gets dry, they can close their stomata and prevent water loss, even though this prevents gas exchange. So these are the first groups where the stomata are both present and functioning in this manner. There were some openings that are like stomata on some of the bryophytes, but they were not effective in doing this on the photosynthetic parts of the plant. Next, some of the early land plants have true vasculature. Some of them don't. They've got something that approaches it but isn't quite there. But some of them really are now able to move water as well as to move nutrients through specialized cells. This is going to allow the plants to get larger. Finally, some of these early land plants have a dominant sporophyte generation. Remember that the bryophytes had a dominant gametophyte generation. The bryophytes that you would typically see walking around are haploid gametophytes. We're now getting to the stage where at least many of these plants, the one that you would likely encounter and notice is now a sporophyte. Here's a couple more illustrations of what a couple of these groups look like. You won't be responsible for knowing them, but this is an example of Rhynia, and it's got an interesting sort of branching pattern. These are spore-producing structures up here, and this is Cooksonia, sort of a weird, almost fantastical-looking plant. also with an interesting branching structure. We now will switch and focus on the Lycophytes themselves. This is a very ancient group. It evolved at least 400 million years ago. If I recall correctly, this fossil shown here is probably closer to 350 million years, give or take. But even though it's that old, you can see it looks very clearly like a plant, and you can see that there's pretty clearly leaves on this. So true leaves are something that we'll see are new with the Lycophytes. And we'll just emphasize this one more time. If we look at our phylogeny here, and now focus on the Lycophytes, we can see that the Lycophytes are the sister group. In other words, they share a common ancestor with all of the other vascular plants. So the other vascular plants are shown in orange here. And here's the common ancestor between them and the Lycophytes. That means if we want to know something about what the ancestor of all vascular plants looked like, the Lycophytes, the ones that broke off first, are going to be our best clue. Lycophytes are also called lycopods. This might be the more common word, but since I've been using Lycophyte throughout the course, I'm going to stick with it as well as I can. They are the earliest diverging plants that are still alive. If we go back to this phylogeny, there might have been other branches here, but they're no longer present. This group, we can still go outside and find them. Lycophytes are vascular plants. They have xylem, they have phloem, they have stomata, and the stomata are on photosynthetic parts, and it allows them to regulate photosynthesis and water loss. And, oops, I put this on twice. They have a vascular bundle. We've already said that. All of the species we have today are herbaceous. None form wood and none get very large. We'll see at the end that there used to be ones that were much larger. Lycophytes have a dominant sporophyte generation. This is unlike the bryophytes, which, as we've already said, had a dominant gametophyte generation. Let's look at this diagram, and I hope it will make it clear. Over here is a moss, which is one kind of bryophyte, and the part of the plant that you encounter throughout the year that is photosynthetic is this green part down here, and these are all gametophytes. The part of the plant that is fleeting, it's only there long enough to reproduce, and it's not photosynthetic, is the sporophyte. So these form just long enough to make spores and they die. The gametophyte is doing the hard work and living for longer time periods. In contrast, now let's look at the Lycophytes. In the Lycophytes, the large part, the part that you would notice if you were outside walking around, this is now the sporophyte, the diploid generation. It is photosynthetic. The gametophyte is this small little thing here that is maybe on the scale of millimeters large. You probably wouldn't notice it. In some cases, it's going to even stay entirely below ground. So this is now a very reduced generation, while the sporophyte is the dominant one. That's an important change, because remember the gametophyte here is haploid. It has only one set of chromosomes per cell. We've talked about why that's not favorable. Now we have a dominant stage that is diploid. It has two sets of chromosomes per cell, and we've talked about why that can be more favorable. Lycophytes have true leaves. Mosses have things that look like this, but they're not true leaves. The reason is that as we defined leaves when we talked about plant organs, we said that like all plant organs, a leaf has to have 3 layers. It has to have vasculature, it has to have ground tissue, and it has to have an epidermis. Well, mosses do not have true leaves because they don't have true vasculature. so therefore they can't have this component. Lycophytes, they do have vasculature. As a result of this, they are able to have thicker leaves. I would like you to look at your terrarium. And in your terrariums, you have both a lycophyte planted, that is your spike moss, and you also have a true moss planted. You can tell them apart easily. The true moss has thin leaves that you can see through if you hold them up to the light. The lycophyte has much thicker leaves that you can't see through. The lycophyte should look darker green, the moss should look lighter green. The stem on the lycophyte is also a little bit thicker than the stem on the mosses. Now, these are true leaves in the lycophyte, but they're going to differ from the leaves that we see in the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperm. The difference is that in the lycophytes, there's only one vein in each of these leaves in most cases. In almost all ferns and all gymnosperms and angiosperms, the veins are going to branch and there will be multiple veins in each leaf. Lycophytes have true roots as well. Remember that the mosses and other bryophytes don't have true roots, again because to be a true plant organ, there needs to be vasculature, and the mosses lack vasculature. So the mosses had rhizoids, but they were only one cell wide. Here what we have are true roots that are many cells wide rather. They're not huge, but this would be many cells across if you looked at it through a microscope. They have vasculature, they have ground tissue, and again they have epidermis, the three parts necessary to be a true organ. Now the roots are a little bit different than in the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. There's a simpler branching pattern. They don't do lateral roots in the same way that those other groups do. Nevertheless, we are going to consider these true roots. Lycophyte reproduction is pretty similar to ferns. The sporophyte, remember that's the big generation we see here, is going to make spores. And it's going to make those spores in specialized groups of cells called sporangium is the singular, or sporangia is the plural. And these are going to be structures associated with leaves. In some species, the leaves with sporangia are all aggregated together, and it forms these cone-like structures. In other groups, the sporangia are going to be spread out on leaves throughout the sporophyte, and it's not going to be a distinctive looking structure. The gametophytes for lycophytes have some different characteristics among different groups. Something in common to all of the lycophytes, and this is something that is shared with the bryophytes, like the liverworts and mosses, is that the sperms still have to swim from the gametophyte that made the sperm to a gametophyte that has eggs. So the lycophytes are able to occupy terrestrial ground. Remember, they have a cuticle, they have vasculature, they have true roots. They can survive under dry conditions. But in order for them to do sexual reproduction, there needs to be water around, at least for long enough for sperm from one gametophyte to swim to the egg on another gametophyte. I'm next going to show you a couple of examples of common lycophytes. These plants, maybe not these exact species, but pretty close relatives that will look very similar, are ones that you can find if you go hiking in the woods around here. Ground pine is common. It forms, it spreads clonally and will oftentimes occupy an area several yards across, and it looks like a patch of tiny Christmas trees, maybe 6 inches tall. They're called ground pines. They're not true pines, but because they look like little pine trees growing near the ground, they get this name. Another plant that you can find, I've found this in the mountains in very southern North Carolina, so just across the border from us here in Spartanburg, is spike moss. And remember, this is growing in your terrariums. It looks like a moss, but you can tell it's not a moss because it has thicker leaves and true roots. The genus of this happens to be Phylogeniella. So nowadays we only have these very small plants that grow near the ground. As we said earlier, all of the ones we still have are herbaceous. But if we were to go back far enough in time, let's imagine going back 300 to 350 million years ago. At that point, lycopods were dominant. They were the most common trees and they formed large forests. So you can imagine walking through entire forests of trees of lycophytes. And this period is called the Carboniferous period. It's called this because when these trees died and decayed, they didn't fully break down. Instead, the carbon in their bodies, at least some of it, was stored and was transformed into coal and other fossil fuels that we use today. So our current industrial revolution is largely powered by lycophytes that were around 300 million years ago. Let's end this lecture with some final thoughts. First, the lycophytes that we find today, like the ones I showed you pictures of, have probably changed very little from ancient ones. We can tell this by looking at ancient fossils and comparing them to plants that we still find. So this is a group that, even though it's been around for a long time, has evolved very slowly. Second, as we just mentioned with regard to the Carboniferous period, ancient lycophytes fuel our economy today. They're not very important plants nowadays, but their ancestors are very important to us for this reason. Third, lycophytes are not very common and they're not very diverse. However, they're still very important because we can look at their traits and that gives us a window into the traits of the very first vascular plants to have evolved and then later diverged into all of the other ferns and seed plants that are common today. Finally, just one last reminder that lycophytes are capable of a fully terrestrial life cycle. They can grow on dry land. This is new compared to the bryophytes, and their only limitation is that at some point there has to be enough water that sperm can move from a gametophyte that made the sperm to a gametophyte with an egg. In our next lecture, we're going to follow our phylogeny a little bit further and look at the transition from lycophytes to ferns.